The cold dawn air stung Captain Jake Bradley's lungs as he checked the lines on his 26-foot commercial fishing boat one more time. The weathered dock at Port Arthur, Texas, creaked beneath his boots, and the familiar smell of diesel fuel and salt water filled his nostrils. At 42 years old, Jake had spent half his life working these waters of the Gulf of Mexico, building a modest but honest living catching snapper and grouper to sell to the seafood markets along the coast. His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency as he secured the coolers, checked the fuel gauge, and started the engine. The forecast had called for clear skies and calm seas, perfect conditions for a 3-day fishing run to his favorite spot 70 miles offshore, where the continental shelf dropped into deeper waters. Jake's younger brother Danny had offered to come along, but Jake had declined. He preferred the solitude of solo trips, the rhythm of hauling nets, the satisfaction of a good catch without conversation breaking his concentration. His ex-wife Rachel had hated these extended trips, said he loved the ocean more than his family. Maybe she'd been right. After the divorce 2 years ago, Jake had thrown himself even deeper into his work, leaving before sunrise and returning with holds full of fish and a mind emptied of everything except the simple mechanics of survival and profit. He radioed the Coast Guard with his float plan, noting his destination coordinates and expected return date of August 18th. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink and gold as he steered the boat through the harbor entrance and into the open Gulf. Before we continue with Jake's incredible journey, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories of survival and rescue. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. Jake found his spot where the warmer blue water met the greener coastal current, an underwater transition zone where fish congregated in impressive numbers. He worked from dawn until dark, hauling in red snapper, grouper, and amberjack, carefully icing them in the coolers below deck. The solitude felt good, almost healing. At night, he'd sit on the deck with a thermos of coffee, watching stars emerge across the black dome of sky, feeling small, but somehow connected to something larger than himself. The VHF radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other fishermen, but Jake mostly kept to himself, content with the company of seabirds that circled overhead during the day and the gentle rocking of the boat at night. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, everything changed. Jake was checking his GPS when he noticed the barometric pressure had dropped dramatically in just an hour. The sky to the southwest had turned an ominous grey-green color, and the wind had shifted from its usual southeasterly pattern to gusting from the west. He'd seen enough storms in his years on the water to recognize the signs of a serious blow developing fast. He immediately began securing everything on deck, lashing down the coolers and preparing to make a run for port. But before he could get the anchor pulled and the engine to full throttle, the storm hit with savage fury. Waves that had been 3 feet suddenly swelled to 10, then 12 feet. Walls of green water that crashed over the bow and sent torrents of seawater flooding across the deck. The wind screamed like something alive and malevolent, tearing at the antennas and ripping away anything not bolted down. Jake fought the wheel, trying to keep the bow pointed into the waves, but a massive swell caught the boat broadside and nearly capsized it. Water poured into the cabin through the half-open door, and Jake heard the terrible sound of equipment crashing and breaking below. He grabbed the radio to send a distress call, but another wave hit, and the radio went dead, likely flooded with salt water. The GPS screen flickered once and went dark. For 6 hours, Jake battled the storm with every ounce of strength and skill he possessed. His arms ached from gripping the wheel, his eyes burned from salt spray, and fear tasted like copper in his mouth. Lightning split the sky in jagged forks, illuminating mountains of water that seemed impossible, apocalyptic. Around midnight, he heard a grinding sound from below and realized with sick certainty that the engine had flooded. The boat immediately began to wallow in the troughs between waves, no longer under power, completely at the mercy of wind and current. Jake deployed the sea anchor, a makeshift drogue he fashioned from a canvas tarp and rope, hoping it would keep the bow pointed into the waves and prevent a fatal rollover. Sometime before dawn, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind dropped to a steady gale, and the waves, while still dangerous, lost their murderous peaks. Jake, exhausted beyond anything he'd ever experienced, lashed himself to the console with a safety line and allowed himself to close his eyes for a few minutes. When he woke, the sun was rising on a world transformed. The ocean stretched empty and vast in every direction, no land visible on any horizon, no other boats, no aircraft. His boat was still afloat, but badly damaged. The radio was completely dead, the GPS destroyed, the engine ruined by saltwater intrusion. His cell phone, which he'd kept in a waterproof case, showed no signal this far offshore. He was alone, adrift, and completely cut off from the world. Jake took stock of his situation with the methodical thinking that had kept him alive through the night. The hull seemed intact, no major leaks, which was the most important thing. He had perhaps 15 gallons of fresh water in plastic jugs, though 2 had been lost overboard during the storm. His food supply consisted of crackers, canned beans, some dried jerky, and energy bars, maybe enough for a week if he rationed carefully. The coolers of fish were useless now, the ice melted, the fish beginning to spoil in the heat. He dumped them overboard, watching sharks appear almost instantly to feast on the unexpected bounty. The sight of those dark fins circling his disabled boat sent a chill down his spine, despite the climbing heat of the morning sun. Without engine power or functioning electronics, Jake had to rely on seamanship skills he'd learned decades ago, but rarely used in the GPS era. He studied the sun's path to determine east and west, noting that the current seemed to be carrying him generally southward, away from the Texas coast and deeper into the Gulf of Mexico. He knew the Coast Guard would initiate a search when he failed to return on August 18th, now just 2 days away. They'd look along his filed route, searching the area where he'd reported he'd be fishing. But the storm had pushed him miles from that position, and the vastness of the Gulf meant search areas spanning thousands of square miles. His best hope was to stay with the boat, make himself as visible as possible, and conserve resources while waiting for rescue. The first week tested Jake's patience more than his survival skills. He rationed his water to 2 cups a day, barely enough in the brutal August heat that turned the boat's deck into a griddle. He rigged a canvas tarp over part of the deck to create shade, and spent most of the day huddled beneath it, trying to conserve energy and limit perspiration. At night, the temperature dropped, and he'd sometimes shiver in his damp clothes, unable to get truly warm. He saw 3 ships during that first week, distant shapes on the horizon. Each time he fired one of his 6 emergency flares, watching the orange star arc into the sky. Each time, the ship continued on its course, too far away to see his signal. After the 3rd failure, Jake wept, the first tears he'd shed since his daughter's funeral 5 years ago, when a drunk driver had taken her at age 16. By day 10, Jake had consumed all his stored food and most of the fresh water. Rescue hadn't come, and he realized with grim clarity that he had to adapt or die. He'd been a fisherman his entire adult life, and now he would have to fish for his own survival. He fashioned a crude fishing line from rope he'd found in a storage compartment, using a bent nail as a hook and small pieces of leather from his work gloves as bait. To his surprise, small fish were attracted almost immediately to the shadow of the boat. He caught his first fish, a small jack, and forced himself to eat it raw, gagging on the slimy texture and trying not to think about parasites or bacteria. The flying fish saved his life. They began appearing around the boat in increasing numbers, and during the night, several would leap from the water and land on the deck, confused by the boat's silhouette. Jake would wake at dawn to find 2 or 3 fish flopping on the deck, a gift from the ocean itself. He learned to gut them quickly, eating the flesh raw and discovering that the eyeballs, while disgusting, contained precious fluid that helped offset his dehydration. He used the fish guts as bait to catch larger fish, establishing a sustainable cycle. The act of fishing gave him purpose, a reason to wake up each day, a rhythm that kept despair at bay. He talked to himself constantly, telling stories from his childhood, reciting song lyrics, anything to keep his mind active and prevent the terrible silence from consuming his sanity. Rain became Jake's obsession. The Gulf summer brought afternoon thunderstorms, brief violent downpours that he learned to anticipate by watching the clouds. He rigged his tarp into a funnel system, anchoring the corners with fishing weights and creating a low point in the center that drained into a plastic bucket. The first time it worked, capturing nearly a gallon of clean rainwater, Jake laughed and cried at the same time, dancing on the deck like a madman. He learned to strip off his clothes when it rained, letting the fresh water wash away the salt crust that accumulated on his skin and caused painful rashes and sores. The rainwater tasted like heaven, sweet and pure, and he'd drink his fill before carefully storing every drop he could capture for the inevitable days of drought that followed. The physical transformation was dramatic. Jake had been a solid 200 pounds when the storm hit, muscle built from years of hauling nets and heavy equipment. By the third week, his body had begun consuming itself. His ribs showed clearly through skin that had turned dark brown from constant sun exposure despite the tarp shelter. His hands, once thick and strong, looked skeletal, the bones and tendons standing out in sharp relief. Salt sores covered his legs and back, some infected and weeping fluid. He developed a constant headache from dehydration and malnutrition. His beard grew wild and matted, his hair bleached by sun and salt. When he caught his reflection in a piece of chrome trim, he barely recognized the gaunt, sun-blackened stranger staring back. But the mental challenges proved even harder than the physical suffering. Jake found himself having conversations with people who weren't there. His daughter Melissa would sit on the bow and they'd talk about her plans for college, her boyfriend, all the futures that had been stolen from her. His brother Danny would appear at sunset, and they'd argue about football, about politics, about their father's legacy. Jake knew these were hallucinations, products of isolation and malnutrition, but they felt completely real and became something he looked forward to, breaks in the crushing loneliness. He marked each day by carving a notch in the wooden gunnel with his fishing knife, a ritual that helped him maintain some connection to time's passage even as the days blurred together in endless cycles of heat and thirst and hunger. The sharks terrified and fascinated him in equal measure. Several large bull sharks had become regular visitors, circling the boat at dawn and dusk, their dark shapes gliding through the clear water. Jake learned to read their behavior, recognizing the difference between curious investigation and aggressive posturing. Once, when he was fishing, a 6-foot shark rose from below and took the fish he'd just hooked, biting through the rope line like it was thread. Another time, he watched a massive hammerhead, perhaps 14 feet long, patrol the perimeter of the boat for an entire afternoon, its strange head swiveling as it studied this floating anomaly. Jake never entered the water, not even to cool off in the worst heat, knowing that a single mistake would be fatal. By the 4th week, Jake had given up hope of rescue. No one was coming. The search would have been called off days ago. His family would have held a memorial service, mourned him, begun the process of moving on. He was a ghost, a dead man who didn't know enough to stop breathing. This realization should have broken him, but instead it brought a strange peace. He stopped scanning the horizon for ships. He focused entirely on the immediate challenges of each day, catching food, collecting water, protecting his deteriorating body from the sun. maintaining the small rituals that kept his mind organized and functional. He sang hymns he'd learned as a child in his grandmother's Baptist church, the words coming back from some deep memory vault, bringing comfort, even though he'd long since abandoned any formal faith. The storm on day 27 nearly finished what the first storm had started. It came from the east, a massive system that turned the sky black at midday and generated waves that dwarfed even those from the August tempest. Jake lashed himself to the console again and commended his soul to whatever power might be listening. For 12 hours, the boat was tossed like a toy, lifted on waves that must have been 20 feet tall and dropped into troughs where the wind disappeared and the sound of the ocean became a deep, terrifying roar. His tarp shelter was torn away in the first hour. His precious water supply, 4 gallons stored in plastic jugs, was swept overboard when a wave broke over the stern. The boat took on water faster than it could drain, and Jake began to bail with a plastic container, knowing even as he did so that it was probably futile. But the boat, battered and ancient as it was, somehow held together. As dawn broke on day 28, Jake found himself still alive, still afloat, but in worse shape than ever before. He had no fresh water left at all. His fishing line was gone. Most of his meager equipment had been lost. His body was a mass of bruises and new cuts from being thrown against the console and cabin wall. For the first time since the ordeal began, Jake seriously considered ending it. He could slip over the side, let the ocean take him, find peace in the deep water. It would be easier than continuing this impossible struggle. He sat on the deck with his legs dangling over the side, looking into the clear blue water, watching a school of small fish dart through the sunlight. What stopped him was a memory, unexpected and vivid. He was 8 years old, fishing with his father from a pier in Galveston. They'd been catching nothing all morning, and Jake had been ready to give up, bored and hot. His father had said, "The fish don't know we're waiting, son. But if we leave, we're guaranteed not to catch anything. Stay, and there's always a chance." It was such a simple memory, meaningless really, but it sparked something in Jake. If he quit now, there was zero chance. If he kept going, even suffering as he was, there remained some possibility, however slim, of survival. He pulled his legs back onto the deck, fashioned a new fishing line from strands of rope braided together, and bent another nail into a hook shape. Within an hour, he'd caught 2 small fish. That night it rained, and he collected nearly 3 gallons of water using a plastic sheet he'd found wedged under a seat. The hallucinations intensified as he entered the 5th week. His dead daughter was now a constant presence, sitting beside him during the hottest part of the day, telling him stories, singing songs. She looked exactly as she had at 16, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face animated and full of life. Jake knew she wasn't real, understood on some level that his brain was creating her from desperation and trauma, but she felt real, and her presence gave him a reason to keep fighting. "You can't give up, Daddy," she'd say. "Mom and Uncle Danny need to know what happened to you. You have to make it home and tell them." So he kept going, one day at a time, sometimes 1 hour at a time, eating flying fish and raw catches, drinking rainwater and sometimes in desperation, small amounts of fluid from fish eyes and spinal columns. His body had become an emaciated ruin by the 32nd day. Jake estimated he'd lost more than 70 pounds. Every movement was exhausting. His muscles had atrophied to the point where pulling in even a small fish required enormous effort. The salt sores on his body had multiplied, and several were badly infected, red and swollen and hot to the touch. He developed a fever that left him shaking and delirious, babbling nonsense, unable to distinguish between waking and dreaming. For 3 days he barely moved, lying in the shade of the cabin overhang, drifting in and out of consciousness, certain that death was finally coming to claim him. But on the morning of day 34, the fever broke. Jake woke feeling weak, but clear-headed for the first time in days. The sun was just rising, painting the ocean in shades of gold and pink. He sat up slowly, every muscle protesting, and looked around at the endless water. And there, perhaps 3 miles to the north, he saw something that made his heart stutter. A ship. It was a large vessel, probably a container ship or tanker, moving on a steady course that would take it past his position at a distance of perhaps 2 miles. Jake's hands shook as he retrieved his emergency flare kit from the waterproof compartment under the console. He had 1 flare left, just 1, saved from the storm that had taken everything else. His entire survival now depended on this single red cylinder. He forced himself to wait, calculating angles and timing, knowing he'd have only 1 chance. The ship grew slowly larger, close enough now that he could make out its rust-streaked hull and the containers stacked on its deck. When it reached a position roughly 45 degrees off his bow, Jake stood, aimed the flare gun skyward, and pulled the trigger. The flare arced into the morning sky, a brilliant red star trailing smoke. Jake watched it reach its apex and begin to fall, his entire being focused on that distant ship. For long seconds, nothing happened. The ship maintained its course, and despair began to flood through him. They hadn't seen it. He'd failed. But then, miracle of miracles, the ship's horn sounded, a deep blast that echoed across the water. The vessel began to turn, altering course toward his position. Jake collapsed onto the deck, sobbing, his body shaking with emotion too powerful to contain. The ship was the Maersk Denver, a container ship en route from Houston to Panama. The officer on watch had spotted the flare and immediately altered course to investigate. As the massive vessel approached Jake's tiny fishing boat, Captain Andreas Nielsen ordered the ship brought to a stop and deployed a rescue launch. 2 crew members motored across the gap between the vessels, their eyes widening when they saw the skeletal, sunburned figure waving weakly from the disabled fishing boat. Getting Jake aboard the Maersk Denver required a stretcher and winch. He was too weak to climb a ladder, barely able to stand. The ship's medical officer, a Norwegian named Lars Johansen, examined him and immediately started an IV line to address the severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Jake tried to speak, to explain what had happened, but his throat was so damaged from sun and salt that he could only croak out fragments. Storm. 34 days. Texas. Lars simply nodded and told him to rest, that everything would be okay now, that they were taking him to the nearest port with medical facilities. In the ship's medical bay, Jake drifted in and out of sleep as his body began to receive the fluids and nutrients it so desperately needed. Captain Nielsen radioed the U.S. Coast Guard, reporting the rescue and providing Jake's information. The response was immediate and emotional. The Coast Guard had declared Jake Bradley lost at sea and presumed dead 3 weeks earlier. His family had held a memorial service. The fishing community in Port Arthur had mourned him as another good man claimed by the Gulf. The Maersk Denver diverted to Galveston, the nearest major port, where an ambulance was waiting at the dock. Jake was transferred to the University of Texas Medical Branch, where a team of doctors worked to stabilize his condition. He was suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, kidney damage, infected wounds, and a host of other ailments from his ordeal. His weight had dropped to 128 pounds from his normal 200. His skin was burned, blistered, and damaged from constant sun exposure. But he was alive, conscious, and according to the doctors, remarkably lucky to have survived with no apparent permanent organ damage. His brother Danny was the first family member to reach the hospital, running into the ICU room, with tears streaming down his face. "You stubborn son of a bitch," Danny said, gripping Jake's skeletal hand. "We buried you. We had a funeral. Mom gave your eulogy." Jake tried to smile but only managed a grimace. "Sorry I missed it," he whispered. "Was it nice?" They both laughed and cried, the sound bringing nurses running to check on the commotion. His ex-wife Rachel arrived an hour later with their son Tyler, who was now 20 and home from college. Rachel looked at Jake's wasted body and wept, apologizing for things said in anger years ago, telling him how glad she was that he'd survived. The story of Jake Bradley's survival captured national attention within days. News crews descended on the hospital, wanting interviews, asking for details about his 34 days adrift. The Coast Guard conducted an investigation, studying the currents and weather patterns, estimating that Jake had drifted more than 400 miles from his last known position, carried by the loop current into the central Gulf before being pushed northward by the second storm. Marine survival experts called his survival remarkable, noting that most people wouldn't have lasted 2 weeks under such conditions. Jake's knowledge of fishing and his ability to improvise rainwater collection had made the difference between life and death. Jake spent 3 weeks in the hospital, slowly regaining strength as his body healed. Physical therapists helped him rebuild muscle mass. Nutritionists designed meal plans to safely restore his weight. A psychologist visited daily to help him process the trauma of the experience, the hallucinations, the near-death moments. Jake talked about his daughter's visits, how real they'd seemed, how they'd kept him going when nothing else could. The psychologist explained that the brain creates what it needs to survive, that Melissa's presence had been Jake's mind protecting itself from complete breakdown. When he was finally discharged in late September, Jake returned to Port Arthur a changed man. He'd gained back 30 pounds and could walk without assistance, though he tired easily. The fishing community threw a welcome home celebration at the marina, hundreds of people gathering to hear his story and celebrate his impossible survival. Jake stood before them, still gaunt but healing, and tried to put into words what the experience had taught him. "I learned that life is stronger than we think," he said, "that the human body and spirit can endure things that seem impossible. I learned that hope isn't just a feeling. It's a decision you make every single day, sometimes every single hour. I learned that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was, even in the middle of the ocean. And I learned that second chances are real and precious and not to be wasted." Jake Bradley never returned to commercial fishing. The ocean that had been his life and nearly his death held too many complicated emotions. Instead, he became a maritime safety instructor, teaching courses on survival techniques, emergency preparedness, and the importance of proper safety equipment. He spoke at Coast Guard training sessions, sharing his story as a cautionary tale, but also as proof of human resilience. He reconciled with his ex-wife, not as romantic partners, but as friends who recognized how much time they'd wasted on anger. He grew closer to his son and brother, cherishing the relationships he'd taken for granted before the Adrift showed him how fragile everything really was. The disabled fishing boat was recovered by the Coast Guard and eventually purchased by a maritime museum in Houston, where it became part of an exhibit on survival at sea. Visitors could walk around the weathered deck, see the notches Jake had carved to mark the days, examine the crude fishing gear he'd fashioned from rope and nails. A placard told his story in detail, accompanied by photographs of Jake before and after his ordeal, the contrast shocking to anyone who saw them. School groups would gather around the boat, listening to guides explain how one man had survived 34 days on the open ocean with minimal supplies, relying on knowledge, determination, and an unshakable refusal to surrender to despair. On the first anniversary of his rescue, Jake returned to Galveston and chartered a boat to take him back to the approximate area where the Maersk Denver had found him. He stood at the rail, looking out at the endless blue water, remembering the fear and pain and loneliness of those 34 days. But he also remembered the strange beauty of sunrises over the Gulf, the satisfaction of catching a fish that would keep him alive one more day, the sound of rain on his makeshift tarp, the hallucination of his daughter's voice telling him not to give up. He tossed a wreath of flowers into the water, a tribute to the man he'd been before the storm and a blessing for the man he'd become after it. Then he turned the boat toward shore, toward home, toward the future that had almost been taken but had been given back through a combination of skill, luck, and the kind of stubborn endurance that defines the best of human nature.